Welcome to Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the promise of clean energy. This program brings you leading voices in solar and energy storage and sectors impacting renewables, exploring challenges and solutions for industry growth, the true cost of operating and maintaining power plants, and system asset management considerations. My name is Josh Corbett. I welcome you to this episode hosted by Michael Eyman, Managing Director of Origis Services.
Okay, today on Power Players, we've got Kevin Christy, Head of Innovation and Operational Excellence from Lightsource BP. Kevin is a veteran renewable energy industry executive since 2002. And I would like to say a friend and someone that I enjoy talking to and with really, really deep knowledge. Kevin, I follow you across LinkedIn and a lot of the stuff you put out because you always say really interesting things that I find, really valuable. And I'm hoping today is no exception. You're currently the head of innovation and operational excellence Americas for Lightsource BP. And in a minute, I'd love for you to tell me what that means. But to give everybody a sense of who you are, who hasn't had the pleasure to really know you, I understand you're focused on innovation-driven operational excellence and improvements, like mitigating risks for Lightsource BP's investments, sort of in renewables here in the Americas. I think you co-founded the utility scale PV developer Axio Power in 2007, and then successfully sold to SunEdison in 2011. And then while you were at SunEdison, you managed the North American utility scale development portfolio, as I understand it, and served as general manager of North America for SunEdison's global services O&M and asset management team. You also served on the Advanced Solutions Energy Storage team, delivering those next generation commercial applications, battery storage and other types of technologies. And then finally, as the COO of SunEdison's North America utility team. And then following SunEdison with Lightsource, you were the COO for Lightsource for some time as well, as I recall, before BP made the investment and now have transitioned into this new role. So, welcome to Power Players, Kevin. It is a real pleasure to have you today, and I'm excited to see you here on the program. Can you tell me a little bit about your current role and what that means for Lightsource?
Sure, happy to. But first of all, Mike, thanks for having me today. I really appreciate that you had the notion to start this podcast and that Origis has been supportive, and I've listened to some of the content and I think it's well done. So honored.
Thank you. We've got great people making sure I don't screw it up too bad. So I appreciate that. So
guys
tell
like
us about.
I need the help. Yeah, so,
absolutely.
So
tell us about your role. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just talk about the evolution of Lightsource in the U.S. So I came in basically at the tail end of the SunEdison bankruptcy and helped Lightsource spin up a U.S. business. And then in basically the end of 2018, Kevin Smith, our current U.S. CEO, came into the business, and we just continued to grow and add people. And the role that I was in, it just wasn't necessarily the best fit for me and what I do. So in October of last year, this role was created for me specifically in order to take forward some of the innovation projects that I'd already been working on, but more to the point, to free me up to spend most of my time on these types of projects, focusing both on deploying new technologies into solar plants, old technologies in a different way, or even just figuring out a more efficient or better outcome way of doing things. And that's sort of where the operational excellence piece comes in.
Got it. Look, you're a perfect guy for the job, I think. So they've got the right people in the right spot here. But we're not here to talk about innovation across the industry today. We can only handle, we got to take chunks in 30 to 40 minute chunks here. So today we're here to talk about hail, right? So hail is one of those risks that I think, 5-6 years ago, people didn't really talk much about as solar has penetrated into the South Central and Southeastern markets where you've got, these continental air masses meeting these maritime air masses. You've got, You've got cold and dry meeting warm and hot, and that creates convection. And suddenly the solar industry in these large facilities are exposed to weather phenomenon that can be quite destructive, and for which we don't have a lot of history on how to manage. And hail is one of those that, particularly here in Texas, where I'm from and where I live today, is a real risk to these plants. And so you guys have some pretty big plants in Texas. I know you've got a number more large plants that are scheduled for this region. And this has been an area that you've been spending some time, and Lightsource has been spending some time. So talk to me a little bit about the focus on hail and sort of why you're approaching it and how you're looking at it.
Yeah, sure. So this kind of landed on my radar back in April of 2020 when we received our first renewal on our impact project northeast of Dallas. It's a 260 megawatt project. And for the first time, what we were seeing, instead of the typical insurance product that was prevalent prior to that, which was an all-risk policy, right?
Yeah.
So it was the developers lining everything up for finance. You get policy terms from a reputable carrier. An insurance consultant reviews it and signs off and says, this project has a good insurance plan. But it covered all risks. So you had one deductible, one coverage limit. And as long as it was a covered event, they'd all be treated the same. But what fundamentally changed in 2020 is coming out of a number of natural catastrophe events in 2018, 2019, not just hail, but flood and fire experiences on solar plants were all not great in 2018, 2019. So
and insurance costs were going up in that period like 25% per year, as I recall. It was massive.
So we're in what folks in the industry call a hard market. And what that's looked like for hail coverage in particular is separate deductibles and separate coverage limits. So whatever your deductible is for your all-risk policy, your hail deductible is probably higher than that, and your coverage limit is probably lower than what it is in the all-risk portion of the policy. So effectively, you're paying more for less coverage, and that's just one of the ways in which insurers are trying to rebalance the risk, right? Both through premiums and through more restrictive terms. So we've just been living with that. We're now in, I think, our third turn of this, and in each turn, deductibles go up, coverage limits come down, right? So the market is still turning the ratchet on that. And given that this year's hail experience has not been a great one, largely driven by West Texas, I just expect that'll continue. And it will just continue, I guess, until we're able to, as an industry, including our insurance carriers, are able to wrap our head around this and say, we understand this risk, we understand how to mitigate it, so that we know that what's left is whatever sort of makes it through the mitigation defense. That's a very different risk proposition from how it's looked at right now. So my hope is that we can reach a point where this is all just sort of dealt with in the open with data and knowledge, as opposed to using commercial property loss models and nobody really understanding. Like the feedback that we got on our program from insurers was, show us 2 or 3 years of preventing hail damage, and then we'll give you credit, as opposed to just being able to look at the process and procedure and go, you have a mitigation strategy in place, that reduces our risk, and we recognize that, and here's your lower premium, your lower deductible, your higher coverage limit. We're still working towards that, and it might take a bit.
Yeah. Now, if I'd known, Kevin, that you were going to pick on Texas specifically, I don't know if I would have done this. I mean, that's not really fair as a Texan. I mean, come on, hail can happen anywhere, right? That said, yeah, right. That said, unfortunately, the reality is I remember as a kid seeing hail the size of my fist, coming down and punching holes through roofs. And now we're covering parts of Texas with glass.
Yeah.
And not just Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, all the maritime regions. By maritime, I mean coastal. Texas, yes, is coastal. We've got a large coastline on the Gulf of Mexico. And so that feeds energy into those systems. I think a lot of people don't realize, I think, if you cut a piece of hail in half, you'll see like growth rings like a tree, because you have to have that vertical convection where what starts off as a small piece of frozen rain or a dust particle that is then cycled up and down in the vertical column, and layers of ice are frozen, more water, then it gets heavy, it falls out, more water gets accreted, then it gets uplifted again and it freezes, and it just goes through that and gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's so heavy that the wind in that supercell is no longer sufficient to hold it up, and it literally falls out, right? And that's it, or it shoots out to one side. And so hail is very much, although it can happen anywhere, and although I don't want to malign my birth state, Texas is someplace where it happens with some degree of statistical significance. And because of the forces at play, and with global warming, there's more and more energy in the environment, which means more and more heat energy, more and more convection, and you're going to have more and more of these events in places where we haven't really seen it in the past. When you're dealing with insurers, though, and you're looking at sites, are they discriminating between different geographies and different risks relative to this, or are they looking at it as across everything?
Yeah, there is a geographic component to it. I'm not sure how all of them do it, but I suspect it's looking at risk maps, right? So different projects live in different zones from a hail risk perspective. A Munich Re might put out, a map set based upon that. But what we've found, because we do have tools that enable us to go into the historical hailstorms, the last 10 years or so with the dual mode Doppler radar. Prior to that point, it's mostly spotter reports and, government weather stations. And you can actually see when and where hailstones hit relative to a location on your site. So we'll plug our site information in. It'll show 1, 3, and 10-mile radiuses and what the largest hailstone is that hit in that radius on that date. So we're able to build, a 10+ year hail history, including the largest of the size of the hail that hit, according to the radar record anyway. And what we're seeing is that even projects in locations that you might not think could potentially have damaging hail, like southern Pennsylvania, where this project behind me is located. In 2012 or so, this valley, basically the Chambersburg, Pennsylvania area, received hailstones of over 3 inches.
Yeah.
It was very unusual, but it does happen. And so the long and the short of the implication of that for us is we needed to design a program that would cover 100% of our sites, regardless of where they're located.
Are you able to get enough information on all sites? Because the type of Doppler radar you're talking about is typically associated with metropolitan areas where you've got large, large weather installations. Certainly there's overhead satellite resources, but they're not as detailed because you're, one, the power requirements, and two, just because you're looking down versus, sideways, where you're able to characterize vertically these storms in a much more effective way. And so do you get enough information to really, when you're looking at these rural environments, which, as well as I do, you guys do large scale utility solar, thousands and thousands of acres, and it's not available in metropolitan Denver, it's or Dallas, it's out in the hinterland. So are you able to characterize it accurately given those limitations?
Enough to have a sense of whether or not it's a risk for that particular area. But in a way, like I said, it almost doesn't matter because we implement this program for 100% of our sites in construction and in operations. So
are there resources that you guys use to characterize those risks that other people can also use that are out there, whether they're NOAA or whatever? I mean,
sure.
Where's that information?
Yeah, I'm happy to walk you through some of the tools that we use. So first of all, so how we deal with this issue is all about the nature and design of our hail mitigation program. I mean, it's widely accepted knowledge in the industry right now that the way that you mitigate for hail is you tilt your modules to the maximum tilt that they'll go to And you basically have to pick your poison, whether it's east or west. And some manufacturers have some guidance on how to deal with that. Others don't care. You can do it east or west. But once you pick your poison, the strike force is just going to be a function of the 1/2 mass times velocity squared
Angle
of
of
the
incidence
hailstone
of
coming
impact.
down
Yeah.
to hit your module, right? And it's going to be a combination of how much force gets absorbed by the module versus how much gets deflected off of it. And the higher the angle, hopefully, if the hailstone's coming straight down, then you'll deflect up to 2/3 of the energy in that hailstone. Now, wind can complicate things because wind can change the incoming direction of hailstones, but really going into full tilt really is the sort of accepted way of mitigating this risk. It's kind of the best that you can do. So then the question becomes, how do you decide when to do that? And that's where the tools come into place, and I'm happy to walk you through that.
Yeah. So before we go to the win and how to trigger it, some questions on, do all the trackers provide the same amount of tilt angle capability? I don't think so.
Nope.
So what have you
Nope.
guys seen out there as some of the tracker technologies that are good and maybe some that are bad? I don't want to throw anybody into the bus here. Maybe just talk about the good.
Yeah. So, well, we only have ATI and Nextracker in our US fleet. And so we've answered all the questions with those guys. ATI can go plus or minus 52 degrees. Nextracker can go plus or minus 50 or 60, depending upon the structure.
So not so far off.
No, not far off at all.
Yeah. Now you mentioned pick your poison as well. Given that you said you're going to go to the max either east or west, and it's a bit of a coin toss, I think, given how these storms develop. What do you mean by pick your poison? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but what does it mean to everybody else?
Well, you're either going minus to the east or plus to the west, right? And so your hailstow protocol will include the degree of tilt plus or minus, right?
Yeah. Are there other risks though that you're dealing with at the same time as the hail that it matters?
Well, there's always concern over wind, right? Because often coincident with these thunderstorms are high wind events.
Yes.
And so the concern is if you are tilted, say, into the wind, then the hailstones, instead of striking, at this degree of incident angle, the wind can actually change. Sorry, I'm like on a podcast using my hands and
no,
fingers.
It's okay.
Pointing.
We do video too. I mean, just
Yeah.
just explain what you're doing with your hands for the people that
So
are just
to explain to the listeners, imagine you've got a solar module that's tilted at 50 degrees, and the wind is blowing 2.5-inch hailstone at like 40 miles an hour, which really means it's basically subtracting 20 degrees from that tilt that you've got. So instead of striking at 60 degrees and shedding 2/3 of its force, it'll strike at 40 degrees and shed something less than 2/3 of the force.
something
That's
like
the
closer
concern.
to half.
Yeah, that's the concern, is that the wind could actually blow the hailstones directly into the modules. But there's concerns the opposite as well, in that if the modules have their backs to the wind effectively, then the rear side frame can be like effectively capture the wind instead of letting it blow off like the front glass does, and that would increase the amount of force on the back of that module, and you could potentially blow clips or blow the module, the front glass out of the frame. We haven't had anything like that happen, but those are just, there's concerns that are expressed about both, outcomes.
Yeah,
It's
interesting to me. Like oftentimes during a developing storm or a mature storm, there's enough force to keep these things aloft, and when the storm collapses, is when you get heavy rains, you get hail that basically comes out of that collapsing structure, which can go up to 50,000 feet.
Yeah.
And but as also part of that collapsing structure, you get columns of wind that flow down to the bottom in microbursts and then go out laterally on a 360 degrees, or sometimes in a more predominant wind direction, depending on the direction of the aloft winds. But
yep.
By going to 50 degrees, aren't you creating a sail in the very event where you've got now you've got high winds that are often associated. Like, how do you pick between those risks, and how does insurance look at you making that choice when you go to make a claim?
Yeah, I'm not going to say so. We've had a discussion before about wind dynamics during a hailstorm, and I think it's really important to maybe take a minute and talk about that, because it's never as simple as the wind comes from this direction.
No.
Throughout the duration of the event, right?
Yeah.
Both because where your site is relative to that center point of updraft and downdraft, that'll dictate, what direction the wind is hitting the site, and where it is in the updraft and downdraft, activity. So if there's a thunderstorm headed straight for your site and it's in updraft mode, then effectively the wind is being sucked across your site towards that updraft, right?
Yeah.
As soon as the downdraft starts, that pressure reverses, and now you've got wind coming out from the center of the downdraft. And so, depending upon where your site is relative to that, and then you have the convective nature of the storms as well. They swirl. So what we've seen is we've just taken the 15-minute intervals where a hailstorm or a thunderstorm is passing over or near our site, and we'll just chart out the wind speed and direction during that event. And what we find is the wind flips around to both sides of the compass and points in between throughout that 15-minute event, right?
Yep.
So you can't successfully decide that you're going to point your array in this location, and it's going to minimize the wind element of what can happen to your array, just because it's so dynamic. You can't predict it.
So and I haven't seen this yet, and maybe you have, so I'll ask a question that's a little bit forward thinking. You've got insurance for hail, you've got insurance for wind, you've got different stow angles for wind events as versus hail. The problem is they happen at the same time and in varying degrees. Your hail changes throughout the maturity cycle of a storm, your wind direction changes. You get funneling effects from terrain, like in the that you see from behind or from buildings or even trees, so that you can get funneling that amplifies or diffuses wind at different phases. And so, particularly in areas like the Southeast where you have more hilly terrain, right? And so how do you deal with an insurance claim where you go to a hail stow and then your site gets torn up by a microburst that came from the wrong direction, and your insurance comes back and says, well, we would have covered it, except it wasn't in wind stow, and this is a wind event because wind is what tore this up. And you say, yeah, but we were prepping for hail. And they'll say, well, but there wasn't any hail. But there's no way for you to know that at the time. I just see this catch-22 playing out. Do you have experience with that? Have you had these conversations? Because I haven't as of yet, but I know they're coming.
Yeah. No, we haven't had the conversation. First of all, we haven't actually been, and none of our sites have been damaged over the last 2 years from a hail event. Knock on wood, but we're always ready. Just in the last year and a couple of months, we've dispatched projects almost 70 times, 70 different dispatch events. So, and basically the reason for that is because there's a few design considerations in our program. One is it has to cover 100% of our projects from in construction through to operations, and it has to have what we call zero false negatives, meaning you can't have damaging hail arrive at any of our sites where we are not already in stow mode when the damaging hail arrives. Right. That's what I mean by zero false negatives.
That by itself is a tough thing to do.
Yeah, which is why we actually have 3 lines of defense, which I can talk about in a bit. But the whole point here, Mike, is just to make sure that we have a program that has, I'll kind of characterize it like we do with uptime for data centers, right? You're into the nines, so 99 point. That's really what we're driving towards, and you kind of have to. I mean, I think we have to as an industry, because the scale at which we're already operating is daunting.
Yes,
that's going to be multiplied, by factors of 10 probably by the time you and I are done on this earth. So that really means we have to have something that is repeatable, scalable, reliable.
So totally agree. I'm looking forward to that conversation with insurance. It's going to happen eventually, and I'm probably going to be sitting here thinking like, I knew this was going to happen, and this is just as ridiculous and hard to navigate as I thought it was going to be. We'll put that aside for a moment, that future tragic conversation, which I think we'll probably all have from time to time. Let's talk a little bit. You guys have done a lot with your programs, the 3-layer defense that you referred to. And I think a lot of us can learn a lot from that. Can you talk a little bit about your program? Like, what did you put in place? Why? What are those 3 layers? How can people put in programs, for their own companies that really work and take advantage of what we know today?
Yeah, well, I'd say, first of all, there are some tools and services available today that we didn't have access to a couple of years ago. And so we can do more now than, initially we did. But what we did initially is we took some commercially available tools, including, first and foremost, the Storm Prediction Center has a website that has all of the day's concerns in it. And you can pick the convective outlook. It's called the Day 1 Convective Outlook. And this is what talks about the National Weather Service's view on severe thunderstorm risk across the United States. And you can filter that by hail risk in that tool.
Really?
And
I
then
didn't know you could do that. That's really interesting.
You can filter down to hail risk.
I'm a bit of a weather nerd, and I'm learning things from you. This is fantastic.
It's a nice service. It's a really nice service. So you can filter down to hail, and it will show you a risk banding of whatever areas around the country where they think there's a risk of significant hail, like 1 inch or larger is the criteria, and the risk bands start at 5%. The next risk band is 15%, and then it goes to 30, 45, and above. But generally speaking, what we found is that 15% risk band tends to be where the potentially damaging hailstorms arrive, basically 15% or above.
Yeah.
But because none of this is a science, sometimes some of those severe hailstorms happen within a 5% band, close to a 15% band. So we put a buffer around that. And basically within 25 miles of a risk band of 15% or higher, we'll be looking at the hourly weather forecast to see when the thunderstorms are expected to start and when they're expected to end. And then we put an hour buffer on either side, and we create a dispatch order that basically says, at this time, put these trackers into this degree of stow until this time, and then return to normal operations.
Yeah.
So that's how we structure one of these dispatch orders, and then it goes to the O&M provider's operations center. We follow up with a phone call. They do the dispatch. They let us know if they're having any issues with trackers and what they're doing about it. And then, otherwise we won't hear from them again until we go into return to normal operations, and they'll say, as of such and such time, we return the trackers to normal operations. So it's a very, it's a well-worn path. We've done it a number of times with all of our O&M providers. So it's understood. The program is understood.
Do you have any challenges at times with those O&M providers? I know, once you put a tracker into stow, particularly if you've had wind events or things like that, from an operational perspective, I'm concerned about moving those trackers until I get some people out there to look at them to make sure nothing is blown in underneath them. I'm not going to warp or tear anything up by moving them again after the fact. But I can't get people in the field until I know it's safe to be in the field. And with these storms, you get lightning, you get, hail in and of itself is a hazard. And a hard hat won't do it. I certainly, most of our heads are not designed to take the, baseball size hail falling out of the sky.
Oh, yeah.
And so there is, do you guys deal with some delays at times just to make sure that you can make safe the site and you can return it without doing any harm, or have you seen that?
So right now we're working with our O&M providers on I'll back up a little bit. We've completed the coding that we need to do to actually send commands directly to trackers from our own back end, what we call auto stow, right? So we're scheduling tests for this feature over the next couple of weeks at a next tracker site and an ATI site, just to make sure that
please make sure hands and everything are clear before
so what we're discussing is, how do we work with the technicians in the field if it's the time of day where you'd expect to have technicians there, and how do we make sure that they're safe? And I can't say that we've locked in on the method, but certainly one way that we could do that is when we send the alert to the operations center that we want to go into stow. So maybe we put a time buffer on there, and that gives them time to work through whatever tools they use to provide warnings to their staff, be it text messages or if they have their ticketing app where they're able to push safety notices. It's really up to them to let us know what considerations we need to build into it so that their staff can be safe the way that they operate. So from our perspective, we're just saying we're committed to, being a safe partner with you on this. Let's just talk about exactly how we do that for your crews.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. There's a lot of risks associated with these storms. Hail isn't the only one. Wind can blow materials, not just around the site, but from adjacent areas, limbs, if people have
Water
panels
towers.
sitting out, water towers. Yeah. So, it's really important to make sure that people are clear, they're safe before you start moving stuff around. And I want everybody, as they take this and implement their programs, to, really make sure that they're thinking about those people in the field. Well, talk to me a little bit more about like how you guys, what you've seen as results of implementing this. Has there been a benefit? Have the insurance companies taken a different view of you as a result? I mean,
well,
what's been the outcome?
We're still waiting to see it in the numbers, but the feedback that we've gotten. So we've been talking directly to some of the largest insurers about this program, and of course, because they're insuring solar assets, they're out there looking at other folks in the industry and how they approach it. And trust me, Mike, this is not like a horn tooting exercise or anything because we have nothing to sell.
Toot your horn. That's why you're here. We're here to hear about your expertise.
Tell me. So what they say is that this is sort of the gold standard with respect to making sure that the sites are in mitigation mode when a hailstorm comes, because that's the money, right? It's just making sure that you can do that. And so the approach that we've taken to make sure that we do that is, in their characterization, sort of front of the stack. So, but how we do that, and I think probably what the most characteristic difference is we do have human beings looking at the weather every day.
Yes.
We don't operate a 24/7 operations center here in the U.S. So you really just need one person with one person backing them up, looking at the Storm Prediction Center's website once a day and seeing what the risk bands are, right? And if it is looking like a risky day, then and I have monitored the weather for the last couple of years for these projects, so I can just describe what I would do, right? So if I see that it's a higher risk day, then I'm going to be looking at that map that the SPC pushes out every time they update it, which is typically about every 4 hours or so.
Yeah. Do you guys have
the risks do change? They shift around, and we look at the hourly forecasts all throughout the day. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the surface progs change over time. Those weather, a lot of people aren't used to looking at those. We do have an operations center here. We keep, moving maps up that look at the weather and around all those radar sites and everything all across the country, wind, and we try to stay ahead of it. That said, I do think that you guys are well ahead of the industry curve. And, to avoid the inevitable barrage of emails to your inbox with all the subject line "hail" in big letters, are there resources or references or something that we can post when we post this so that people have links they can download and they're not sort of barraging Lightsource VP, you or your managers? Is there something we can do to provide resources on programs, something, white paper, anything?
Right. So I actually had an article run in PV Tech.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say it was the summer of last year that walked everybody through our hail mitigation approach, at least as it was, at this point last year. The only thing that's changed from that to this year is, I think last year I was mentioning, that we're looking at developing automatic stow capabilities. Well, right now we have them and we're just putting them into test. And then after they've been tested for each site, we'll put them into production. And the way that we'll do that is, I think, just one of the other distinguishing elements of the program, at least in terms of what I hear that's out there in the industry, is we have the in-person monitoring 365 days a year by at least 2 Lightsource BP staffers on any given day. That doesn't change. But what we have worked to implement with this auto stow is to provide the means to back those people up. And there's 2 layers of defense that we back up the people layer. The first one is we have a third-party weather service that has an algorithm that has been continually refined that basically plots out a thunderstorm's path.
What service is that exactly?
Well, this one is called DTN.
DTN, Delta Tango November.
Delta Tango November. They're I think the oldest commercial weather provider in the U.S. But there's another very popular algorithm provider out there is NGMaps, INDJI, I believe is how that's spelled.
Yeah.
We've been looking into them for a while. So and Anything Weather is another outfit that has been developing hail algorithms as well. And so just think about that layer. You're getting a layer of third-party intelligence that basically gives you a better indication than a National Weather Service severe thunderstorm warning, and I can talk about what those are in a second. But this is sort of in between, having people physically looking at it. Now you've got a computer running an algorithm that's looking for your problem. That's the second layer of defense. And then the third layer of defense is the National Weather Service has the severe thunderstorm warning, and the way that they issue it is they put a polygon on a map. And if your project is inside that polygon, so we have it set up so that we get that alert on any of our projects. So we're getting the DTN, it's called Storm Corridor alert, that basically is forecasting hail, a potentially hail generating storm headed towards one of our sites. And our system is able to pick that up, just basically maps coordinates. They send coordinates of the thunderstorm, we map it against coordinates of our sites, and act accordingly. So what we'll be able to implement over the next month or so is to have those last 2 triggers be dealt with through auto stow, which is kind of what we were talking about before. And that's where our back end would actually, on its own initiative, stow the trackers after some appropriate safety interval, right? With no need for human intervention. So that's when I talk about like pushing into the 9-9. So if people miss it and the DTN storm algorithm misses it, but the National Weather Service, catches it and, plots that risk on there, then we can act based on the National Weather Service warning. The challenge with that is just time, right? So depending upon where your project is in that polygon, like if you're sitting on the edge of the polygon, the storm's approaching, then you effectively could get 0 warning. The most that you'd get is somewhere in between 30 to 60 minutes. We try to target a 30-minute warning, just to provide us opportunity to deal with things that pop up. And I'll give you a kind of classic one that it's one of those things like you don't anticipate this particular failure mode, but this is why you design these types of programs, right? Is we had a project that we had already tested remote stow capability on. This is not auto stow, but like remote stow, so that the operations center could log in, dispatch.
We have the capability of doing that.
You have the capability as well. Yeah, absolutely. And so under this program, we basically ask them to do that deployment, and then they do it. And so it's all personal interaction, right? So we just want to build those additional layers of, if the people don't catch it, we've got 2 more tripwires in which it could get caught, and that collectively should get us into the 99% plus likelihood that we're going to be in hail stow if potentially damaging hailstorm hits.
Got it. So let me summarize this to make sure I heard this correctly, to make sure, as the dumbest guy on this call, I need to, I'll boil it down too. So there's, first you have people looking at it and sort of, looking at those 24-hour, 48-hour progs and those products from the third party companies and saying, look, we need to worry about these. Then you have an automated system that is taking the weather data and in real time updating what you're expecting. And then finally, the third layer is, okay, everything else failed. Weather's developing in a way that we weren't expecting. But the National Weather Service has put out this we used to call them willy willies, warning centers, warning areas. I don't know if that's a term outside of aviation, but probably willy willies is what we call them. But these warning areas, and then if you're anywhere near that, you try to look for 30 minutes ahead, at which point in time you alert your operators, and they go with what I'm going to call a clear and stow, meaning you got to clear the people, right? And then go to a stow. You don't want to just go to an auto stow without clearing the people, because if somebody's got their fingers in there, or if they're underneath, you're going to cause some issues. So did I say that right? Or did I get that right?
I mean, it's safety first, right? So it's and it all comes down to program design, right? Like you have to design for safety. And so because one safety solution might not work the same for different O&M providers, we're literally working with each one with whom we have a relationship to define what a safe auto stow looks like.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to do one plug, and then we got to wrap up because we're getting close to the end here. But seeing more and more sites that people are developing and delivering that do not have any sort of an O&M building or facility on the site. When you get into these weather events and people have to get safe, there is nowhere for them to go if you don't have something to get them out of the heat, get them out of the hail, get them out of the storm. And 30 minutes may not be enough time if they don't have someplace to go to get those people safe. So I encourage people when they're looking at building these sites to make sure that they don't just think about the site, but they think about the people on those sites.
Yeah.
That's just my own personal plug.
Well, I was saying, Mike, the first line of defense is people. And so we're typically sending out stow orders sometimes, half a day in advance of when the actual stow order goes in, so that the O&M provider will know, when that stow order is going to get executed and be able to coordinate with site staff. We also copy the site staff on the dispatch order. So now we're not counting on those guys to be looking at the email client on their phones, but this again is just where it comes down to making sure that we do whatever we need to do for our O&M providers to make sure that this whole process is safe.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts for people? We're well past our time, but this was an interesting subject, and I wanted to give it the time to develop. And frankly, we probably need to do a few more of these and talk about it a little bit more. But any final thoughts or takeaways that people should take at the end of this, so that they can walk away and do something effective with this information?
Yeah, sure. So, but before I sum it all up, though, I do have to call you out on your Texas aw shucks. I don't think that anybody who's a career naval aviator is anything less than highly intelligent. So,
I don't know. I give you a run for your money, but I appreciate it anyway.
Well, you would know better than I would, but in my experience, you're an astute observer of events in this industry and know what you're talking about. So, okay, so to put a bow on it, all I would say is you have to have a program that is designed to be repeatable, scalable, and reliable. And we are not yet to the point where we believe that that's a fully automated process, right? So we continue to have people monitoring, and we'll continue to have people monitoring this work unless and until we get to the point where we feel that the process that the people do can be reduced to an algorithm itself. And until we get to that point, I just don't think there's any substitute for having people directly involved in it. But it actually doesn't take a lot of time. Using one of the tools that I mentioned, just the SPC website, it's updated, typically every 3 to 4 hours during one of these events. You can look at the hourly forecast and weather.com. Both of those tools are free. You can have an effective, weather monitoring program with just those two things. And so as long as you're able to look at the National Weather Service map and know where your projects are, because obviously they don't plot that out on your map. BP does have the ability to integrate our GIS system with, weather system. So they have a tool called OneMap that's able to use GIS visualization, so we can take our project map of the US and overlay the National Weather Service's risk band so that we can, see just
Right.
an easy visual reference that, yes, our project is inside this band.
That's wonderful. Also, I'd excuse me, I'd love to get any resources we can link to as we populate this and send this out. I'd love for there to be some links and things that people can use to go look at data. So anything I can get from you after the fact, offline, then we'll add that to this when we put that out, and hopefully those will be resources people can use. I will tell you, Origis specifically, once we close this all and wrap it all up, I'm going to be having my ops guys reaching out to your guys, whoever you tell me to, and seeing what we can learn and adopt. Because from what I hear, I do think that you guys are out ahead of the pack, and this is really valuable information and a really sort of rational way to approach what for many is an irrational risk, this randomly occurring risk. But these things are real, and we as an industry, the power industry as a whole, have to understand what the risks are for these sites, and we can't ignore them. What happened with the Fukushima plants in Japan ultimately was an earthquake followed by a tsunami, and that was an environmental concern that had not been contemplated, and the result was disaster. And so here in solar, we have our own things that we have to mitigate, and I think it's important to learn those lessons and to listen to the thinkers and in the industry. And Kevin, I will say, as far as gold standards go, you are that gold standard as far as I'm concerned, and I really appreciate you joining us today on Power Players.
Thanks, Mike. It's my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime. Let's chat on some other stuff.
We're going to do it again. This has been great. Thanks for your time, and we'll have another conversation soon.
Perfect.
Find summary thoughts on this topic and more insights into operating your clean energy assets at origisservices.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the clean energy promise.